Once upon a time, in the quiet village of Asase, lived Uche, a man whose name was synonymous with respect and kindness. Uche's hands were rough and calloused from years of working the fertile soil, and his wisdom was sought by many in the village. He lived with his wife, Grace, and their only daughter, Ada, in a village compound surrounded by large farmland. Uche was quite wealthy, but preferred to live like a commoner, working on his farms for hours. Grace was a woman whose beauty was matched only by her nurturing spirit. She was the center of Uche's world, and their love was the kind that people told stories about. Together, they raised Ada, a bright and joyful child who seemed to carry the warmth of the sun within her. She was the kind of child who laughed easily and made friends with everyone, from the village elders to the goats that roamed the fields. But alongside the Uche family lived Oge, a woman of quiet strength and deep humility. Oge had been a part of their household for as long as anyone could remember. She had come to serve them when Grace was still pregnant with Ada, and over the years, she had become more than just a maid. She was a steady presence, a constant in their lives. Her son, Jojo, was just a few years older than Ada, and he had grown up in the household alongside her, almost like a sibling. Oge was a woman of few words. She performed her duties with diligence, keeping the household running smoothly, and she cared for Ada as if the girl were her own. She was the one who soothed Ada when she cried, who helped her with her lessons, and who tucked her into bed at night. Her love for Ada was deep, and though she knew her place in the family, she never let it interfere with her feelings for the child. Life in the household was peaceful, filled with the rhythms of farm life. The days were long and filled with work, but the evenings were warm and comforting, with Grace's laughter filling the air as she and Uche shared stories by the fireside. Ada and Jojo would sit close by, listening intensely, their young faces lit by the glow of the flames. These were the moments that Uche cherished most, moments when his world felt whole and perfect. But life, as the villagers knew all too well, was often unpredictable. One day, Grace fell ill. It started with a slight cough, nothing that seemed particularly concerning. But as the days passed, the cough worsened, and soon, Grace was bedridden, too weak to rise. Uche called the doctor, a man known for his knowledge of medicines, but despite his efforts, Grace's condition continued to deteriorate. Uche stayed by her side, holding her hand as she drifted in and out of consciousness. Ada, too young to fully grasp the severity of her mother's illness, clung to her father, frightened by the changes in their home. The once lively household was now filled with a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of Grace's labored breathing and the occasional sobs that Uche tried so hard to suppress. The unfortunate happened, and Grace passed away. When Grace passed away, it was as if the light had gone out of Uche's life. He felt hollow, a shell of the man he had once been. The village mourned with him, for Grace had been loved by all. But it was Uche and Ada who felt the loss most keenly. Ada, in her innocence, couldn't understand why her mother had been taken from her. She cried herself to sleep each night, and her father's attempt to comfort her seemed futile. In the days that followed, Oge stepped in quietly, taking over the duties that Grace had once performed. She cared for Ada with a tenderness that surprised even Uche. She would sit with the girl in the evenings, brushing her hair and telling her stories, trying to fill the void that Grace had left behind. Oge also managed the household, ensuring that life continued as smoothly as possible, even as grief threatened to overwhelm them all. Uche watched all this with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. He had always respected Oge for her dedication, but now he had begun to see her in a different light. She wasn't just a servant, she was a vital part of their lives. Someone who had stepped into a role she hadn't been asked to fill, simply because it was needed. Despite this, Uche found it difficult to move forward. His nights were filled with dreams of Grace, and his days were consumed by thoughts of what could have been. He often found himself staring at the place where Grace used to sit, expecting to see her there, smiling at him, but she was gone, and no amount of wishing could bring her back. As the weeks turned into months, Uche's sorrow began to transform into a heavy, unshakable burden. He withdrew from the village, avoiding the gatherings and conversations that had once brought him joy. He found solace only in his work, spending long hours in the fields, trying to escape the memories that had haunted him at home. But no matter how hard he tried, the emptiness remained. Ada too was struggling. She had lost not only her mother, but also the joyful connection she had shared with her father. Uche, consumed by his grief, had become distant, and Ada often felt she was navigating her pain alone. The girl, once full of laughter and energy, became quiet and withdrawn, her eyes filled with a sadness that broke Oge's heart. Oge could see the toll that Grace's death had taken on both father and daughter. She watched as Uche buried himself in his work, and as Ada wandered through the house like a ghost of the child she once was. Oge knew that something had to change, but she also knew that Uche was not yet ready to face the full extent of his loss. So Oge continued to care for Ada, trying to bring some sense of normalcy back into the girl's life. She would wake her up in the mornings with a gentle smile, help her dress, and make sure she had a warm meal before school. In the evenings, Oge would sit with her, listening to her talk about her day, even though Ada's words were few and far between. One evening, after Ada had gone to bed, Oge found herself standing in the doorway of the room that had once belonged to Grace. The door had been closed since her death, but something compelled Oge to open it. As she stepped inside, she was overwhelmed by the memories that filled the space. The scent of Grace's favorite perfume, the way the light filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow on the bed where Grace had once slept. Oge sat on the floor at the edge of the bed and allowed herself to grieve for the woman who had been more than just an employer to her. Grace had treated her with kindness and respect, had welcomed her and her son Jojo into her home, and had trusted her with the care of her daughter. In that moment, Oge made a silent promise to Grace's memory. She would take care of Ada no matter what. As months passed, Oge's role in the household grew. She became more than just a caretaker for Ada. She became a confidant, a source of strength. Ada began to open up to her, sharing her fears and her dreams, and slowly, the girl started to find joy in life again. Oge would take her for walks in the fields, teaching her about the plants and animals, just as Grace had once done. She would braid Ada's hair in the evenings, just as Grace had, and she would tuck her into bed every night, just as Grace did. Uche noticed the change in his daughter. He saw the way Ada's eyes lit up when she was with Oge, and he began to feel a glimmer of hope that perhaps, with time, they could heal. He also noticed how Oge had taken on so much responsibility, not because it was expected of her, but because she cared deeply for Ada. It was during one of these moments of reflection that Uche began to entertain a thought that had been lingering at the back of his mind for some time. But the thought of remarrying was a complicated one. Uche felt a deep loyalty to Grace, and the idea of remarrying another woman felt like a betrayal. He wrestled with the decision for many nights, lying awake in the darkness, torn between his duty to his daughter and his love for his late wife. He knew that Ada needed a mother figure, and Oge had already stepped into that role. But could he bring himself to marry her? Would it be fair to Oge to marry her out of obligation rather than love? One day at sunset, after a particular long day in the fields, Uche sat on the porch, watching the sunset over the hills. The sky was brilliant orange and the air was cool and crisp. As he sat there lost in thought, Oge came out to join him. She carried a cup of tea for him, as she often did, and sat down beside him without saying a word. For a long time, they sat in silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon. It was a comfortable silence, one that spoke of understanding and shared grief. Finally, Uche turned to Oge and spoke, his voice heavy with emotion. "You have done so much for Ada, and for me. I don't know how we would have managed without you." Oge looked at him, her eyes filled with empathy. "It's my duty, Uche. I care for Ada as if she were my own." Uche nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision he knew he had to make. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. "Oge, I have been thinking. Ada needs a mother. She needs someone who can be there for her in ways that I can't. And I believe you are that person." Oge's eyes widened in surprise, but she said nothing, allowing Uche to continue. "I know this isn't a proposal born out of love, at least not in the way that most marriages are. But I respect you, Oge. I trust you, and I know you love Ada. If you were to become my wife, it would bring stability to our household. It would give Ada the mother she needs." Oge's heart raced as she considered his words. This was not the way she had imagined her life would turn out, but she couldn't deny that there was a certain logic to Uche's proposal. She always harbored feelings for Uche, feelings she had never allowed herself to entertain because of her position in the household. But now, here he was, offering her a chance to be more than just a maid, a chance to be a wife, a mother, and an equal partner in the household. After a long pause, Oge nodded, her voice soft but steady. "If that is what you wish, Uche, then I will accept." And so it was decided. Uche and Oge would marry, not out of love, but out of necessity. But both hoped that in time, love would grow. The wedding was a quiet affair, a far cry from the grand celebration that had marked Uche and Grace's union. The villagers gathered to witness the ceremony, offering their blessings and well wishes, though some whispered among themselves, wondering if this marriage was truly what Uche wanted. Oge, dressed in a simple but beautiful gown, stood by Uche's side, her heart a mixture of hope and fear. For a time, things seemed to settle into a new rhythm. Oge took on her role as Uche's wife with grace, continuing to care for Ada and managing the household with the same diligence she always had. Uche, still grieving, found comfort in the stability that Uche brought to their lives. He was grateful for her presence, and slowly, he began to let go of the guilt that had plagued him since Grace's death. Jojo too adjusted to the new dynamics of the household. He had always looked up to Uche as a father figure, and now, officially, he was his stepfather. Jojo and Abba grew even closer, their bond strengthening as they navigated the changes of their lives together. They played together, shared their meals, and whispered secrets late into the night. To an outsider, they would have appeared to be siblings in every way that mattered. But beneath the surface, Oge's insecurities began to fester. Despite her marriage to Uche, she felt like an outsider in her own home. The villagers who had once treated her with kindness now looked at her with suspicion. They whispered behind her back, wondering if she had manipulated Uche into marrying her for his wealth. Even within her own home, Oge felt like a stranger. Uche was kind to her, but there was no love in his eyes. His heart still belonged to Grace, and Oge knew she could never replace her. She tried to push these thoughts aside, focusing on her duties and her son, but the feelings of being second best gnawed at her. It was during this time of inner turmoil that Oge stumbled upon the will. One day, as she was cleaning Uche's study, she noticed a drawer that had been left slightly ajar. She hadn't intended to pry, but something about the way the papers were sticking out caught her eye. Without thinking, she pulled the drawer open and saw a document with Uche's signature at the bottom. Curiosity got the better of her, and she unfolded the paper, her heart pounding in her chest. As her eyes scanned the words, Oge's world came crashing down around her. Uche had willed everything to Ada, every piece of land, every coin, every possession. There was nothing for Oge or her son Jojo. In that moment, all of Oge's fears were confirmed. She was not truly part of the family. She and her son were merely tolerated, not loved. Uche's loyalty was still with his first family, and in his eyes, Jojo was not his son. Oge's love for Uche turned into bitterness. She began to resent Ada, seeing her not as a child he had raised, but as an obstacle to her and her son's future. Dark thoughts began to creep into Oge's mind, thoughts she would never had entertained before. If Ada were gone, everything would change. Jojo would inherit the wealth, and they would finally have a life they deserved. The shift in Oge's behavior was subtle at first. She became more distant, her kindness towards Ada diminishing. She no longer sang her lullabies or brushed her hair. Instead, she left the girl to fend for herself more often, under the guise of encouraging independence. Uche noticed the shift but attributed it to the natural changes of blending into a new family. He trusted Oge to care for Ada just as she always had. But Oge's bitterness continued to grow, and soon she began to plot. She couldn't bear the thought of Ada inheriting everything while she and her son Jojo were left with nothing. She began to consider more drastic measures, her mind racing with plans that she knew were wrong but felt justified. After all, wasn't she just protecting her son's future? As days turned into weeks, Oge's resentment festered. She could no longer bear the sight of Ada, who seemed oblivious to the storm brewing around her. The girl continued to live her life as she always had, playing with Jojo, helping her father in the fields, and going about her chores. Every time Oge saw her, it was a reminder of the future she had been denied. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, Oge made up her mind. She couldn't live like this any longer. She couldn't continue to serve a girl who would one day inherit everything while she and her son were left with nothing. If Ada were gone, all of Uche's wealth would pass to Jojo. They would finally have a life they deserved. The plan began to form in Oge's mind. She would prepare a meal for Ada just as she always did, but this time she would add something extra. A little herb she had learned about from the village healer, one that could be fatal if used in the wrong dosage. She justified her actions by telling herself that it was for Jojo's sake. She was protecting her son's future. The next day, Oge set her plan into motion. She waited until Uche was out in the fields and Ada and Jojo were playing outside. She prepared the meal carefully, adding the poison to Ada's portion. Her hand shook as she stirred the pot, but she pushed her fear aside. It had to be done. When the meal was ready, she called the children in. They sat at the table, laughing and talking as they always did. Oge served them, her heart pounding in her chest as she placed the poisoned food in front of Ada. But then, something unexpected happened. Jojo, who had been protective of his younger sister, reached over and grabbed Ada's plate. "I like yours," he said, reaching out to Ada and switching their plates. He ate the poisoned food. Before Oge could stop him, Jojo had already taken a large bite of the food. Panic surged through her, but she forced herself to remain calm. Maybe it wouldn't work. Maybe the poison wasn't strong enough, Oge thought to herself. But as the minutes passed, Oge's worst fears came true. Jojo began to sweat, his face growing pale. He clutched his stomach, his eyes wide with fear. "Mama, I don't feel well," he gasped. Oge rushed to his side, but it was too late. Within minutes, Jojo collapsed, and no amount of pleading or crying could bring him back. Ada, horrified by what was happening, screamed for her father. Uche came running, his heart shattering as he found his son lifeless in Oge's arms. The village doctor was called, but there was nothing he could do. Jojo was gone. The household descended into chaos after Jojo's death. Uche was inconsolable, devastated by the loss of the boy he had come to love as his own. Ada too was heartbroken, her brother gone in the blink of an eye. She clung to her father, trying to make sense of the tragedy that had befallen them. But Oge was consumed by guilt and rage. Her plan had backfired in the most horrific way possible. Instead of securing her son's future, she had taken his life. The realization was unbearable. She blamed herself, but instead of seeking redemption, she turned her anger towards Ada. In her twisted mind, Ada was the reason Jojo was dead. If the girl hadn't been there, none of this would have happened. Oge's grief twisted into something darker. She began to mistreat Ada openly, no longer caring if anyone noticed. She withheld food, forced the girl to do all the chores, and isolated her from the rest of the village. She found cruel pleasure in making Ada's life miserable, seeing it as a way to punish her for Jojo's death. Uche, still blinded by his own grief, failed to notice the extent of the abuse. Oge was careful to maintain a facade of concern and care when he was around. She would speak softly to Ada in his presence, offering her food and comfort, only to turn cold and cruel the moment he left the room. Ada endured the abuse in silence. She missed her mother, her brother, and the happy days they had shared. But she was strong, stronger than Oge had anticipated. The girl held on to the memories of her mother and Jojo, using them as a source of strength. She knew that if she gave in to despair, Oge would win. The villagers began to notice the changes in Ada. She was no longer the bright and cheerful girl they had known. She had become quiet, withdrawn and thin. Some of the women who had known Grace grew concerned and tried to intervene, but Oge kept them at bay, claiming that Ada was simply grieving and needed time. But the whispers grew louder, and soon, the village elders decided that something had to be done. They couldn't stand by and watch as one of their own suffered in silence. The village elders decided to pay the Uche's household a visit. It was not uncommon for them to intervene in family matters, especially when the well-being of a child was at stake. They arrived one day at sunset, just as Uche was returning from the fields. Oge greeted them with a forced smile, but her heart raced with fear. She knew why they had come. The elders spoke with Uche first, expressing their concerns about Ada. They told him of the changes they had noticed, how the girl seemed withdrawn and malnourished. Uche, who had been wrapped up in his own grief to see what was happening, listened in shock. He couldn't believe that Oge, the woman who had cared for his daughter so well, could be responsible for such cruelty. When the elders confronted Oge, she denied everything. She claimed that Ada was simply mourning her brother and that she had done everything she could to help her. But the elders were not convinced. They had seen too many cases of hidden abuse to be fooled by her lies. Faced with the truth, Oge knew she could no longer maintain her facade. But instead of confessing right away, she tried to outsmart the elders by pleading innocence with one of the village women who had caught her mistreating Ada multiple times. This woman had witnessed Oge's deliberate attempts to isolate Ada and had shared her observations with the elders, leading to the confrontation. Desperate and panicked, Oge tried to manipulate the situation, putting on a show of fake tears and trying to shift the blame onto Ada for being difficult to manage in her grief. But her performance didn't sway the elders, especially after the woman, determined to protect Ada, stepped forward with even more damning evidence of Oge's actions. Finally, realizing that there was no way out, Oge broke down in front of the elders, but it wasn't a clean confession. She began to unravel, lashing out and blaming Uche, Ada, and even Jojo's ghost for her downfall. She admitted to her resentment towards Ada, her anger over the will, and the dark thoughts that had led to the plan of poisoning. She even confessed that Jojo's death had been her fault. Uche was devastated by the revelations. The woman he had trusted, the woman he had married to protect his daughter, had betrayed him in the worst possible way. He could hardly look at her, his heart filled with a mixture of sorrow and anger. The elders were outraged. They could not allow such evil to go unpunished. After a long deliberation, they decided that Oge would be banished from the village. She was no longer welcomed in their community, and she would have to live the rest of her days in solitude, haunted by the consequences of her actions. After Oge's banishment, the household began to heal. It was not an easy process. The scars left by Jojo's death and Oge's betrayal were deep, but Uche and Ada found solace in each other's company. They worked the fields together, shared quiet meals, and spent long evenings talking by the fire. Uche regretted his decision to remarry, feeling that he had failed both Grace and Ada, but Ada, wise beyond her years, forgave him. She knew that her father only wanted what was best for her, and she could see the pain in his eyes. They grieved together, but they also looked towards the future, determined to rebuild their lives. Ada grew into a strong and compassionate woman. She took over the management of her father's estate, ensuring that it continued to thrive. She became a respected figure in the village, known for her kindness and wisdom. The villagers admired her resilience, and many came to her for advice and support. Uche, though older now and weary from the trials he had faced, found peace in his daughter's strength. He knew that Grace would have been proud of the woman Ada had become. As for Oge, her fate was a lonely one. Banished from the village, she wandered the outskirts, living off the land and the occasional scraps left by travelers. She was haunted by the memories of Jojo, her son, whom she had loved more than anything and whose death she had caused. She regretted her actions every day, but there was no redemption for her. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. So viewers, what do you think? Was Uche, Ada's father, at fault for marrying Oge, who brought more suffering into their lives? Was he at fault for being so immersed in his own sorrows that he couldn't be there for his daughter? Was he wrong to will all his properties to his daughter Ada, leaving nothing for his new wife and son? Was Oge's plot to remove Ada from the picture justified by she wanting to secure her son's future? Share your thoughts in the comment section. But one thing is certain, pains, jealousy and greed can drive people to do unimaginable things. Oge, the maid who loved Ada so much, and the same person who made a vow to Grace's memory to protect Ada, plotted to kill her. Circumstances change people, and you never know what they are capable of doing. Thanks for watching this video. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel for more interesting stories like this. Catch you in my next video.